Now, in the previous slide, we discussed the idea that race was conceived as a way to categorize different populations, different people, based on physical appearances, right? Outward appearances, particularly skin color. But then we remarked upon the fact that, once this categorization is set in place, you also see non physical aspects to race, like, let's say, intelligence level, certain traits like X people are all lazy or Y people are uncivilized, things like that, that speak to, culture or even natural inferiority, so to say, right? And, this is how race became a hierarchy in a sense. Okay, that is to say, those people at the top of the hierarchy are, superior, and those below, there's gradations on this hierarchy going southward. Well, they're inferior, right? So, of course, the question is this a natural way to categorize people? That is to say, do all members of a racial group truly share these common traits, common characteristics in the real world? And it's obvious today in the modern world, 2021, right, that the answer is no. There's so much counter evidence to this way of thinking about race. Just to put forth a few, genetically, there is no gene particular to one race. Okay. And needless to say, physical traits apparent between races, let's say skin color, they don't have any effect or any bearing on other characteristics such as intelligence or morality. So, uh, again, I'm arguing this, right? And in fact, it's not really an argument. It's pretty much a fact that race is something human beings created. Okay, in actual truth, as stated in the slide here, academics and scientists, anthropologists, advance the notion that race is created by people. We invented race as a way to differentiate, right? To categorize and classify people in this racial taxonomy, so to say. So, what happens is, through the centuries, it becomes to be seen as natural or even biological again, right? And the thing is, we forget that it was created, right? Things become so normalized that if you subscribe to this worldview on race, you just take it for granted that all people who belong to one certain group are X, Y, or Z, right? All right, so as stated there, race has its beginnings as a social construction with the European global imperialism, okay, the movement of European global imperialism, okay, which roughly takes place between, Columbus going outward, 1492, and then the European age of imperialism collapses with World War One, and then the death knell, if you will, was World War Two, 1945. But this is when historians pinpoint the creation of race, okay, as described so far in this mini lecture. Okay, now, the question you may ask is, well, didn't people differentiate based on skin color before European imperialism? Like, let's say, the times of antiquity. Weren't they saying, black skin, white skin? Yes, they were. Okay, but that's not the primary way people differentiated, you know, uh, between, let's say, their particular population and others. In fact, the primary way it was done before the age of European imperialism was religion. Okay, whether you were Muslim or Christian, right? That's what was paramount. That's what mattered most in classification, right? And in creating, other categorization again of other people. Okay, and then when European explorers and colonizers began to encounter other people in the world, and they ventured beyond it's a small area called Europe, right, to colonize other parts of the world, they began to encounter people with different skin color, right? And they began this classification enterprise, right, of race. Okay. And as I mentioned before, it still lingers on, this idea of race. We still use the word race. Okay. So, going back to race as a social construction, again, this means we created race. It's a construct, right? It's not natural. And here I give some examples here on the bottom part of racial constructions in U.S. history. Okay, one example is the so-called one-drop rule. And what was this? Well, this was around mostly before the 20th century, right? And you had certain states having the one-drop rule. Actually, take that back. Some of it lingered into the 20th century, all right, especially in the South, some southern states. But the one-drop rule is basically this. If it could be determined that you have any African American ancestry, the word they used back then was Negro, okay? They looked in the civic records and say, oh, X and X has a great-grandfather, for example, that was a Negro. Well, they're African American. They're Negro too. It didn't matter how you looked. You could have been blonde and blue eyes, okay? But you were still considered, quote, Negro, simply because of that one drop. Now, other states didn't have that rule, okay? But look at that. It shows how the definition of race, that is to say, who is included as a African American, or, the word back then, Negro, was actually different state to state, right? It differed. Another example is the Irish not being considered white. Now, this seems so counterintuitive to us today, but, in the very beginning of Irish immigration to the United States, they were not considered white. That's to say, Anglo-Saxon. In fact, there's a lot of deep-seated enmity between the Irish and the English, right, or Anglo-Saxon, because England actually colonized Ireland. You may know that, right? But because of that, they were not considered white. They were actually one step above the so-called Negro, okay, in terms of that racial hierarchy that I referred to earlier, okay? And another example would be the early science of race. This is when anthropologists and scientists were trying to think about ways to taxonomize different people from different race. They would actually measure the skulls of people to see who had the larger cranium, right? Therefore more intelligent, supposedly. Things like that, right? And even, the facial features, the noses, they would take the scientific approach, right? Trying to determine what exactly is race, right, from a scientific point of view. And in fact, some of them came up with early classifications. In fact, at one point, and this was accepted in the court of law actually, our more scientific classifications basically promoted this idea that there are really three races in the world, okay? And the three races are, quote, Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, okay? Mongoloid being Asians, right? Negroid, Africans or African Americans too, and Caucasoid, pretty much everyone else. Okay, so this was supposedly universal, right? Applied to all places, all times, all points of history. All right, but obviously, that's not a good way to classify people, right? So, these three examples alone should make us aware that, yeah, it seems like race could never be pinpointed with perfect accuracy, and that's because we created it, right? And even today, right, you see incidents where official classification changes. For example, South Asians, that's to say, Asians originating from India, Pakistan, and so forth, right? They were once categorized as Caucasians, okay, before the 1990s. But they actually petitioned to change their status in the U.S. Census to be categorized as Asians and not whites. Why? Because they were able to gain certain um, um, benefits from that. Okay, as immigrants. Okay, so there you go. And speaking of census, seems interesting to note that if you look at the history of U.S. Census and the way they categorize people according to race, it fluctuates constantly, right? Why this fluctuation every 10 years? Well, it's because, race is something we created. And even at the bureaucratic or administrative level, it's a social construct. Okay. Now, even though race is a social construct, however, it does have a social reality. What does this mean? It means that, sure, we invented it, but because many people accept it as actual truth, and because it's associated with certain traits that are hierarchical, right? Found in the hierarchy of, people being superior to others, well, there's consequences to that in the social world. So, again, the argument is that though race is indeed a social construction, it has a social reality, quote unquote. So, yes, race has a social reality. And this leads us back to the question, why discuss race, right? Why does race remain an explosive issue today? And here, it's almost unavoidable, but, you have to talk about it from the political perspective, right? Now, there's irony, by the way, behind this, right? Race is a big issue, yet some people in society today, US society, believe that race should not be discussed, right? That the more we discuss race in the public sphere, that this only serves to fan the flames, so to say, of racial division, right? Why do they believe this? Because people who subscribe to that idea of eliminating race from political discourse, social discourse, believe that we live in a so-called colorblind society, quote unquote, a colorblind society. Okay. And a colorblind society, as you could probably infer, is the belief that race does not matter in our society today. Okay. All right. So there's the first thing to notice there, the divergent opinions regarding race. And again, this is painting with a broad brush. Okay, it's actually more complicated than this. That is to say, the conservative view versus the liberal view. But it does, I think, characterize, in general terms, the divisions of society based on race. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is how many whites and many blacks, again, being general, how they diverge about the issue of race and racism and discrimination. Okay, for example, um, when it came to the issue of relative fairness between whites and blacks, in a Pew Research Center, that's to say PEW, okay, you may have heard the Pew Research Center, in a fairly recent poll conducted, they asked the question, was the average African American person better off, worse off, or just about the same, right, as average white persons, right? That was the question. So when it came to questioning Caucasians, they answered this way that more than half, that is, more than half of Caucasians felt this, that African Americans were just as well off, if not better off, than Caucasians. In fact, three-fourths of whites questioned thought African Americans were treated fairly as whites in the workplace, in the educational system, in the court of law, by the police, and so forth. Okay. Now, when they asked African Americans about this, 59%, okay, the average believed, excuse me, that the average African American person was worse off than average whites. Most felt that blacks were treated unfairly. Okay, in fact, a third of them felt they were actually discriminated in life at some point in their life based on race, their skin color. So the overall conclusion here is that among whites, most felt race. Over half again, not all, but over half of whites felt race was no longer a powerful factor in the United States, right? That, in fact, we live in a colorblind society. Okay. On the other hand, most ethnic minorities, okay, do feel race is still a powerful force, a powerful issue, a determinant in one's status in U.S. society. That we don't live in a colorblind society. Okay. Um, Now, a lot of this um, divergence of opinion was, as noted by some scholars, is the way they interpret the legacy of the civil rights movement, okay, during the 1950s and 1960s, all right? And they found this out, that according to those who believe in a colorblind society, they feel that the civil rights movement was successful in its goal, right? You did eradicate legal segregation, and you see a improvement in the attitudes of racial prejudice, right? Now I know there's always going to be white supremacists in the Klan, but putting that aside, that's not the norm, right? They feel. That is to say, people who believe in a colorblind society. These are extremists. Most Caucasians do not believe in that, right? They feel. And therefore, it's a colorblind society, they argue. Now, if there are any remaining vestiges or remnants of racial inequality today, uh, according to people who believe in the colorblind society idea, they believe it's due to racial minorities not taking advantage of the or let's just say failing to take advantages of afforded to them by the civil rights movement. Okay, for example, well, they argue African Americans do not try hard enough if they fall behind, you know, if they fall into the exhaust fumes of society, so to say. Well, they depend too much on welfare, things like that, right? And furthermore, they say, well, it's a colorblind society. We don't need any more affirmative action policies. We don't need any of that stuff. In fact, they say that's racism in reverse. Okay. So, in other words, if you subscribe to the colorblind society, you're likely to say that any racial inequality around today is the outcome of non-racial dynamics like, crime, family fragmentation, the lack of work ethic, and so forth. Okay. All right. Now, on the other hand, um, and again, broadly speaking, I even hesitate to use these terms, but conservative and liberal, right? The liberal view on race relation believes this: while the civil rights movement was indeed successful in dismantling institutional uh, and legal segregation, you still have racism enduring. And there is still institutional racism. Maybe not the institutional segregation that we see with Jim Crow, right? That is to say, different, separation of coloreds and whites in the public spaces like restrooms and so forth. But they still exist in some institutions, right? Um, like, for example, the educational system, like the legal system, the court of law, like the law enforcement institutions, right? So it endures today, right? And their evidence is, if you look at the record, there's a disproportionate amount of arrests and even brutality committed against persons of color, right? Especially when it comes to law enforcement, right? Police brutality. So Also, look at the incarceration rates of, in particular, African Americans and Latinx populations. It's higher compared to other groups, and there's also contention surrounding whether or not their imprisonment and incarceration was something that was slanted, against people of color, right, or caused by factors. Okay, so here is what divides a lot of society today. Okay, now the main point here is that you should notice the irony. Okay, from the so-called conservative view, they want to sweep race under the carpet, so to say. Many of them feel we should discuss race, that it only divides the nation and polarizes us further, right? Let's say that, hey, color doesn't exist. Let's just base it on merit and individualism, right? On the other side, it's saying that, discussing race is a crucial step to healing racial divisions. It's the opposite view, right? Why? Because if you really understand the history of race, and this is relating to History 123, you'll see that it's not always been about equality. In fact, it's the stark opposite, right? So the main point is that, from the liberal view, discussing race is a crucial step to healing those racial divisions. It does not divide us, but actually educates us, and in the process will unite us in the future. Now, this is a class in ethnic history, and here's the importance that I argue when we study this, okay? And you already could infer this from this mini lecture, all right? What happens when we analyze U.S. history not from the perspective of, let's say, the center, right? Meaning, those, let's say, the typical middle class American in history, right, stretching back to the colonial period. What happens when you analyze the perspective not from the center, but let alone the elite, right, like Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Carnegie? But what happens when we analyze history from the angle of vision held by those in the margins of society? Does it change the historical narrative? Does it interrogate our taken for granted beliefs like freedom and democracy and equality? Okay, what do their historical experiences teach us? Okay, so hopefully this course will provide that glimpse, right? If not full-fledged panoramic view of, in this case, the place of Asians in U.S. society. Okay, and on a final note, during the pandemic last year, right, and even in this year, there was a lot of discussion about the rise in violence leveled towards Asians in the United States, and some people wondered why all of a sudden, Asians seem like this quiet, invisible population, right? Only 6% of our population today. Well, this is one thing you're going to learn in this course. Asians have always been subject to, if not violence, then, racial discrimination, marginalization, and not belonging to the United States. Okay, not belonging. Okay, they'll be barred from citizenship, barred from immigration, subject to racial violence, and so forth. Okay, it may not be a pretty picture, but as I argue earlier, it's crucial to understand racial experiences in order to gain a more fuller and educated and sophisticated understanding of race in the country today.